Hi everybody. I want to recommend two Twilight Zone episodes because as opposed to One Step Beyond, I cannot upload Twilight Zone episodes because they're still copyrighted, right? So I want to tell you about at least, two episodes that I highly recommend you to watch if you haven't already. Of course, as I said, I can't upload them, so just, I'm sure you can find them somewhere. One is the Obsolete Man, which is basically is kind of similar to Fahrenheit 451, but it's a really interesting and good episodes with some good points, and it's really thought-provoking. And of course, it's also a little bit like 1984. So this is one episode that I highly recommend you to watch if you haven't watched it already. And the other episode that I want to recommend is the episode The Mirror with Peter Falk playing Fidel Castro. Well, it's not really Fidel Castro, of course. It's Ramos Clemente. But if you watch the episode, you'll agree with me that it's really Fidel Castro. And Peter Falk is really, everybody knows Peter Falk from Columbo, right? But so it's kind of unusual to see him basically play the bad guy, but he does a great job at it. And he's just watch the episode and you realize that he's perfect for playing Fidel Castro. He was made to play Fidel Castro. He's the perfect actor for that. he's really amazing. So go check that episode out. And actually, I've watched an interview with Peter Falk a while back, and he actually said that he went to Cuba basically at the time the episode came out. Of course, a little earlier. The episode wasn't made yet, and the Cuban Revolution had started at that point, but it wasn't finished yet. So it was shortly before Fidel Castro came to power, or took power, but the revolution hadn't finished at that point. It had started, but it hadn't finished, and the old government was still in place. So at that time, Peter Falk comes over to Cuba on a holiday or business trip, whatever, and he actually gets arrested. He got arrested because they mistook him. They actually mistook him for a revolutionary, because he actually looks so similar to Fidel Castro. Even without the makeup and stuff. they basically mistook him for Fidel Castro and arrested him. So of course they realized that he wasn't actually Fidel Castro and released him. But that just goes to show you that he really is the perfect actor to play Fidel Castro. And not only does he look like Fidel Castro, and if you watch the episode, you will agree with me that he can indeed look like Fidel Castro. But he also does a brilliant job. In his acting is just brilliant. So be sure to check this episode out. I would really love to upload this episode, and I'm really a huge fan of the Twilight Zone as well. But as I said, I can't upload the Twilight Zone because it's still copyrighted, so I can only upload One Step Beyond, even though I, of course, also like the Twilight Zone. But of course, I already talked about this. Of course, One Step Beyond came before the Twilight Zone. So some people are still saying, yeah, One Step Beyond is a rip-off of the Twilight Zone. No, it's not. It's actually the other way around. But I still love the Twilight Zone. And those two episodes I just mentioned, they're the ones that really stuck in my mind. you probably have watched them already. But if you haven't, be sure to check them out. And even if you don't like the Twilight Zone, at least watch those 2 episodes. At least watch those 2. If you don't if you don't watch the other episodes, well, that's bad enough. But at least watch those 2, and it's gonna be okay, because those are really brilliant episodes. Oh, and it also kind of goes to show you that, in a sense, the Twilight Zone did have an advantage over One Step Beyond, in the sense that One Step Beyond claimed, or One Step Beyond's premise was that their episodes were not fiction, but were based on actual events, right? Of course, that's not always true. And they did, of course, One Step Beyond also uses some artistic freedom, some artistic liberties. But in most cases, it's more or less true that at least they were inspired by actual events, and they were kind of based on facts, more or less. It was, of course, made for entertainment after all, but it was, yes, it was based on facts, and a lot of the episodes of One Step Beyond, they were based on history books, and they were based on facts, and you can research it, and so it's not made up, or at least not entirely, right? But that also meant that most of the material that One Step Beyond focuses on is older material, right? It doesn't really go beyond the Second World War, because they can't really address current events, because of course they're also mainly focusing on supernatural occurrences, right? So for example, during that time, that was also like actually right during that time, like when One Step Beyond was airing, I think that was also the time of Roosevelt and those people who claim to have seen aliens and UFOs and stuff. So why didn't they do an episode about that? Well, simple. They can't do with a format like that. You cannot address current events, especially if you claim that it's based on fact and claim that it has some supernatural elements. Because if you just do an episode of something that just happened just now, well, the event might still be unfolding, right? And it might turn out that it was all a hoax, right? And you took it for granted, and it doesn't work that way. So they have to use older material. So they can't address current events with a format like that. But the Twilight Zone can do that, right? Precisely because the Twilight Zone doesn't claim to be based on facts and to be based on actual events, it allows them to also address current events and not just historical events like One Step Beyond. So that's what they did there. And then that isn't the only episode where they did this. Because when the episode The Mirror came out, that was what was currently unfolding in Cuba, right? That was a current event at that time, and they just addressed that current event directly, which of course they could only do because they're of course not claiming to be addressing that event directly, because they're not saying it's Fidel Castro. They made up some name and said, oh, it's Ramos Clemente, who just happens to look exactly like Fidel Castro and does the exact same thing, but it's not Fidel Castro, And that way they can address current events. And of course, they did the same thing in Star Trek, but I'm not gonna go into that. Yeah. So anyway, be sure to check out the Twilight Zone episodes, The Obsolete Man and The Mirror. Oh, and just one more thing about the Peter Falk episode. I mean, the episode also, well, it makes a lot of good points. But one aspect that maybe isn't as obvious. I mean, I don't have to explain this episode because it's really obvious. But one point that maybe not a lot of people think about after watching this episode, but that is very obvious, is what is it with dictators that they always carry guns around, right? I mean, that's not a coincidence, right? For example, I watched a documentary about North Korea, and it said that Kim Jong-un and also his father, Kim Jong-il, that they were very good at shooting, and they were excellent marksmen, and could hit any target, and they always carried their guns around. I also watched a documentary about Scientology, just as an example. I'm not going to talk about Scientology now, but that would get too long. But it just mentioned that David Miscavige, basically the top guy in Scientology, the guy who runs the show, right? That he too is an excellent marksman. He always practices shooting and always carries his gun around. Right? Why do they do that, right? Well, the episode tells you why. It's because they're afraid. They were afraid. So a lot of people think, oh yeah, if I could become some kind of dictator and have all those people blindly believing in me and following me, how great that would be, right? Well, no, and this episode tells you why not. Don't be jealous of people like Fidel Castro, because they actually it doesn't appear that way, but they lead a miserable life, a truly miserable life, more miserable than any of their citizens whom they torture and put in forced labor camps. Much more miserable, because even those people in forced labor camps, I'm telling you, they're not as afraid. They're not as afraid as those dictators. Because, that's the reason why they always carry guns around. That's the reason why they're excellent marksmen, because they're afraid. They're constantly afraid of some, what they call counter-revolutionary, right? They're afraid of somebody else, taking their ranks, just shooting them, and it's true. I mean, they're not really well liked. I mean, they got their position by violence, so naturally they're afraid that somebody will use the same means to dispose of them. So their whole life they're constantly afraid. So the episode The Mirror only showed a small aspect, a small fraction of the life of somebody like Fidel Castro. But I think, is he still alive? Of course, his life in actuality was much longer. Than I think he outlived Peter Falk, right? At the very least, he outlived Peter Falk. So he had a long life, and he might still be alive. I don't know. I don't really care. But the point is, then a lot of people say, oh yeah, he has such a long life, even though he's such a bastard. Why doesn't he die already? Well, that's just it. His whole life, he's constantly under that kind of fear that is portrayed in that episode. So I say the longer he lives, the better it is, because he doesn't have a nice life. You know, he's constantly under that fear. It's not something to aspire to. You know, so yeah, that's basically kind of the downside of being a dictator.